Imagine a power so profound it reaches into your vault and declares that what you possess is no longer truly yours. Right now, a radical legal experiment is unfolding in California. A proposed wealth tax that would allow the state to tax not just what you earn, but what you already own. To critics, this is a blatant seizure of private property. If you think your property is a right that cannot be revoked, you are ignoring the most chilling chapter in the American ledger. To find the blueprint for what is happening today, we have to look back nearly 100 years. This is the story of 1933, a year when the United States government didn't just ask for a contribution. They demanded your life savings. They didn't want your income. They wanted your gold. On this episode of Fortune and Ruin, we are uncovering the great gold heist. This isn't just history, it is a warning. Because when a system is on the brink of collapse, the first thing it consumes is the private property of its people. Today on Fortune and Ruin, we unearth the true story of the great gold confiscation, an act so audacious it remains the ultimate blueprint for the seizure of private property. Was it national salvation or the greatest heist in history? To understand the heist, we must first understand the ruin. In 1929, the American economic engine didn't just stall, it exploded. The stock market crash of October was the opening act of a tragedy that would last a decade. Within months, $30 billion in wealth simply evaporated. It was as if a giant eraser had been taken to the nation's balance sheet. But the crash was just the beginning. By 1932, the Great Depression had settled into the very bones of the country. Industrial production was down 50%. 1 in every 4 Americans was out of work. People weren't just losing their jobs, they were losing their faith in the very idea of America. At the heart of this collapse was a mechanism called the gold standard. Today, we live in a world of fiat money, currency backed by nothing but a promise. But in 1932, the US dollar was a receipt. It was a contract. You could walk into any bank, hand over a $20 bill, and receive an ounce of physical gold. This was the hard money anchor. It prevented the government from printing money to solve its problems. But during the Depression, this anchor became a noose. As thousands of banks failed, taking the life savings of millions with them, a mass panic set in. People realized that paper money was only as good as the bank that held it. But gold was eternal. Across the country, a bank run began. Not just for cash, but for metal. Citizens were trading their paper for gold and hiding it in their floorboards, their mattresses, and their gardens. They were protecting their personal fortune from the systemic ruin around them. This created a nightmare for the Federal Reserve. Under the law, they had to hold 40 cents worth of gold for every paper dollar they issued. As the people withdrew gold, the government was legally forced to shrink the money supply. The more the people tried to save themselves, the faster the nation's economy suffocated. The stage was set for a radical solution. The state was about to strike back. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He took the oath of office in March 1933, inheriting a nation that was literally hemorrhaging its gold reserves. On the very day he was inaugurated, 38 states had already closed their banks to stop the panic. Roosevelt knew that if he wanted to fund his New Deal, he needed to print money, and as long as the gold standard existed, he couldn't. He had to sever the link. He had to stop the people from owning the one thing that kept the government in check. Just 36 hours after taking office, FDR declared a national bank holiday. All banks in America were ordered to close. The doors were locked. The tellers were sent home. For the first time in history, the American people were completely cut off from their own wealth. While the public waited in confusion, FDR's Brain Trust, a group of radical economic advisors, was scouring the law books for a way to make their move permanent. They found their weapon in a forgotten relic, the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. This was a wartime law, passed to stop Americans from funding Imperial Germany. It gave the president total control over gold and currency during times of war, but there was no war in 1933. FDR simply declared a national emergency, effectively declaring war on the economic crisis. In doing so, he turned the American citizen into a foreign enemy of the state's recovery. This was the legal foundation for the seizure of private property. On April 5, 1933, the trap was finally sprung. FDR signed Executive Order 6. At the time, they thought it was a fair exchange. They had no idea that they were being set up for the second act of the heist. But what if you didn't comply? What if you believed that your private property was truly yours? The government was ready for you. Enter the era of the gold police. The Treasury Department launched a massive investigation into the nation's safe deposit boxes. Banks were ordered to report any customer who had withdrawn gold in the months leading up to the order. It was a climate of absolute paranoia. People began to wonder if their neighbors were informants. This was the dark side of the seizure of private property. It required a surveillance state. The government began tracking the flow of gold like it was tracking a narcotics shipment. One man, Gus McDermott, decided to fight back. He was a small-time investor who refused to hand over his gold. He argued that the executive order was unconstitutional, that the government had no right to take what he had earned. The state didn't just take his gold. They made an example of him. He was arrested, dragged through the courts, and his story was used to scare the rest of the country into submission. The hunt for hoarders continued for years. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the precedent. The government was proving that in a crisis, there is no such thing as private. There is only what the state allows you to keep. By the end of 1933, the government's vaults were overflowing. They had successfully gathered the people's gold at the price of $20.67 an ounce. Now, it was time for the final act of the fortune and ruin play. On January 30th, 1934, FDR signed the Gold Reserve Act. This law did something that many thought was impossible. It permanently transferred all gold held by the Federal Reserve to the U.S. Treasury. The gold was now officially the property of the government. And then, the magic trick. The very next day, Roosevelt used his new powers to revalue gold. He raised the price from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Do you see what happened? The government bought your property for $20, then immediately told the world it was worth $35. They created a $2.8 billion paper profit for the Treasury in a single afternoon. It was a masterclass in devaluation. By making gold more expensive, they made the dollar worth less. They had effectively stolen nearly 70% of the purchasing power from every citizen who had complied with the order. They used the fortune they seized from the public to fund the New Deal, paying the people back with currency that was now worth significantly less. It was a tax that required no vote, no debate, and no consent. To house this massive stolen fortune, the government needed a fortress. They chose a site in Kentucky and built a monument to their power, the United States Bullion Depository. better known as Fort Knox. Completed in 1936, Fort Knox wasn't built to protect America's wealth. It was built to hide it. It was the prison of fortune. The gold inside didn't belong to the banks, and it certainly didn't belong to the people. It was the state's ultimate insurance policy against its own debts. For decades, the sheer amount of gold inside Fort Knox was used to project American power to the rest of the world. But it was a power built on a foundation of seizure. The seizure was challenged in the Supreme Court in the Gold Clause cases. Citizens argued that the government couldn't simply rewrite private contracts and take property. In a narrow 5-4 decision, the court sided with the government. They ruled that while the government's actions were morally questionable, they were legally permissible during a national emergency. Justice McReynolds, in one of the most famous dissents in history, stood up and declared, "The Constitution, as we have known it, is gone. This is a Nero-like act." He was right. The highest court in the land had just validated that in a time of ruin, your property is whatever the state says it is. The Great Gold Heist didn't just change the lives of Americans, it changed the trajectory of the entire planet. Because the US government now held the world's largest hoard of gold, stolen from its own citizens, it could dictate the rules of the global economy. In 1944, as World War II was ending, leaders from 44 nations met at a hotel in New Hampshire for the Bretton Woods Conference. The goal was to build a new financial world. And because America had the gold, America had the power. They decided that the US dollar would be the world's reserve currency. Every other currency, the pound, the franc, the yen, would be pegged to the dollar. And the dollar? The dollar would be pegged to gold at that stolen price of $35 an ounce. For 30 years, the world operated on this system. It was the golden age of the American empire. But it was a system built on a lie. The US was printing more dollars than it had gold to back up. Eventually, the rest of the world realized that the fortune in Fort Knox wasn't enough to cover the debts of the state. In 1971, Richard Nixon finally ended the charade. He closed the gold window, officially severing the dollar's last link to reality. We entered the era of pure fiat money, a world where the government can print fortune out of thin air and where the ruin of inflation is a permanent part of life. This brings us back to today. Why does a 93-year-old heist matter to you? Because the blueprint has never changed. In 1933, they needed to knock on your door to take your property. In 2026, they only need a line of code. If a government can declare a national emergency to combat climate change, or inequality, or a pandemic, and then use that emergency to redefine your private property, are you truly the owner of anything? The gold police of the 1930s have been replaced by the algorithmic police of the 2020s. The seizure of private property is no longer a physical act, it is a digital one. Your bank account can be frozen, you can be debanked, your transactions can be blocked, and your wealth can be devalued by inflation, all without a single soldier ever stepping onto your porch. History is a circle. Those who forget the ruins of the past are doomed to see their fortunes crumble in the future. The Great Gold Heist taught us that property is a fragile thing. It taught us that emergencies are the primary mechanism used by the state to rewrite the rules of money. As we enter this new era of digital control and massive debt, the question isn't whether it could happen again. The question is, what is your gold today? Is it Bitcoin? Is it land? Is it physical metal? And more importantly, how do you plan to protect it from the next executive order? This is Fortune and Ruin. We don't just look at the news, we look at the ledger. Subscribe to stay ahead of the system before the system catches up to you. Because the only way to protect your fortune is to understand the history of your ruin.